Envy is really a common feeling. In most cases, it's really a harmless matter of people wishing they had someone else's attributes or possessions. In some cases, though, envy can be a motivation for murder. Stephen Morgan was that case. He was obsessed with good looks and smart and beautiful people. This obsession took root with Joanna Justin Jennich, a student at Wesleyan University. This envious school shooter took it in his own hands to destroy all the smart and beautiful people at Wesleyan. The sin envy. Envy is defined as the desire for oneself and to destroy another's good fortune, wanting what someone else has, resentment. This is the why behind the crime, the motive. I'm Ashley Willcott. As a TV anchor, a former judge, and a trial attorney, I would say almost every case that I've seen has intersected with one of the 7 deadly sins: pride, greed, wrath, envy, lust, gluttony, and sloth. The opposite of the 7 heavenly virtues, temptations that taken too far turn deadly. This week, we break down the case of Stephen Morgan and how the deadly sin of envy turned into a school shooting. A little later, I'm joined by Dr. Carole Lieberman, MD, in our breakdown segment when we go deep into the how and the why of school shooters, a case that still lives on today. Let's get into it. This is the Deadly 7. Joanna Justin Jennich and Stephen Morgan knew each other from a 6-week summer course that they took together at New York University in 2007. Joanna, the young woman, ended up filing a complaint against Stephen Morgan after the class finished and told the public safety department that she had been receiving harassing emails and phone calls from him. The school said that its officers attempted to investigate her claims, but that she declined to pursue the case. On May 6th of 2009, Stephen Morgan, who is from Marblehead, Massachusetts, drove and left his car near the bookstore of Wesleyan University. Justin Jennich was working at that bookstore at the Red and Black Cafe on that fateful Wednesday afternoon when a shooter wearing a wig walked in and shot her several times. That shooter, later identified as Stephen Morgan. Stephen Morgan used a pulley system. It was like a dumbwaiter in the bookstore to get from the main floor of the bookstore to the basement, where he ditched his disguise and his handgun and escaped. There was a 2-day manhunt for Morgan. It ended when he surrendered to the Connecticut police after he was spooked by seeing his own photo on the front page of a newspaper at a convenience store. Morgan asked the convenience store clerk to use the phone, and he called the police and turned himself in. He said that he was walking around and went in to buy a drink when he saw his picture on the newspaper. After he called the police, he walked outside and waited for the police. As soon as the officers got there, Stephen Morgan said, "I am the Wesleyan shooter." When police asked him where he'd been since the murder, he said, "I've been walking around in the rain." Morgan had been obsessed with Joanna for a long time, and in fact, he'd written in his journal that he also thought it was okay to go on a killing spree at Wesleyan. Why did he want to kill people there? Well, his journal gives us a clue. In an entry written approximately 2 hours before the school shooting, Morgan referred to all the smart and beautiful people that attended Wesleyan University. Morgan went to trial for the murder, and ultimately he was found not guilty by reason of insanity after a trial that portrayed him as mentally ill as he stalked and harassed the young woman. A 3-judge panel agreed with the defense, and 32-year-old Stephen Morgan was committed to Connecticut's maximum security psychiatric hospital for the criminally insane. Joining us now, I'm so honored to have such a renowned expert, Dr. Carole Lieberman, MD, a forensic psychiatrist, a trial expert witness. We've been on shows together before, and she's going to have great insight into this case. Before we jump in, one of the reasons I chose this particular case is because it was the beginning of the school shooters, right? It was one who I think had plans to shoot up many of the people at Wesleyan University. He started with the one that he was seemingly obsessed with. He did kill her, and then he ended up turning himself in when he panicked because he saw his face on the newspaper. We're going to get into all of those aspects of it, but the reality is, it's a look at why do school shooters shoot up schools? Why? It's now an epidemic, in my opinion. And Dr. Lieberman, I'm going to ask you to weigh in on that, but we see it in the news all the time. We're almost immune to it. It's like, oh, another school shooting. How many people did they kill this time? So he was one of the first of these school shooters. So let me stop there. I do want to say one more thing, and then I'll stop. I don't think he's the first school shooter that really is envious of the people that he then decides to shoot and kill. But let me just stop there and let you kind of jump in with your immediate thoughts on this case.
Well, this is a very interesting case. There are a lot of similarities among school shooters, but they each have their own little special signature. Um, the the typical profile of a school shooter is someone who was raised in well, first of all, it's most often a young man, a boy, or teenager, and they come from a dysfunctional home where there's either abuse or neglect or both. And often they have some kind of mental illness, which is uh, either not treated at all, or they begin to get some kind of treatment and then they fall through the cracks. And then pretty much every school shooter is, and this with this case, it's particularly interesting how it came about, but usually they are obsessed with violent video games, all the school shooters.
Wow.
And then also and also violent films as well. They watch violent movies, and then they're often a loner and or bullied. And then they have an access to weapons, and then something happens in their life that tips them off, throws them off, and makes it that day.
So I have so many different pieces of this that I would love to break down with you because the first thing I have to say is when you were going through this, you said, but it's interesting how it came about with Stephen Morgan. What did you mean by that? And how might it have been different than the school shooters you just talked about?
Well, it's hard to say. I haven't found anything that describes his obsession with violent video games before he did the shooting.
Hmm.
However, after he pled guilty, after he was found not guilty he was found not guilty by reason of insanity, and he was made to go to a state mental hospital, and he got 60 years in this hospital. And it turns out that a someone who worked in the hospital told the media that he was watching violent video games every day. He got to watch and play violent video games. And this staff person, told the media this because he didn't think that that was a very good idea. And of course, it isn't, because in fact, there are studies upon studies for decades that show that violent media causes people to, the more hours of violent media they watch, the more they will, the more likely they are to commit some kind of aggressive acts. Not everybody becomes a school shooter or a serial killer, but they might have domestic violence, perpetrate domestic violence, or they may fight over a parking spot or road rage or something like that, or plane rage. Um, and so it's proportional. So here it is, this Connecticut Valley State Hospital, and a hospital that's associated with that, psychiatric hospitals, and they're allowing their patients to play violent video games. I mean, if that isn't insane. And also, they have their rule was, I don't know if it's still this way, but their rule was that the people who were in maximum security, therefore the people who would be less likely to get out soon, they can play all the violent video games they want. The people who are in minimum security don't get to play violent
Isn't
video.
that weird? Like, these are things I never would have thought of, doctor, and I just think that you bringing them up makes me realize how many issues we have, right? We're some of the best criminal justice system in the world. We're best in terms of care to be provided, but yet how many things are missing pieces like that, the
Yeah.
violence that's allowed to be viewed while they're in a hospital for help as a result of killing someone due to mental illness. So a lot of missing pieces in our system sometimes. When you talk about the mental illness point, with Stephen Morgan, we know that he was found to be mentally ill and was sentenced to be in the facility, the psychiatric facility. Does that mean or take away from the fact that it appears as if he was obsessed with this young lady, Joanna, that he was obsessed with the beautiful people at Wesleyan University where he went to do this school shooting? Can he have that as the motive and also have the mental health issues?
Yes, yes. In fact, he was diagnosed ultimately as paranoid schizophrenic. And, his obsession with Johanna, and her, thinking of her as with the beautiful people in her college and Wesleyan and all that, he was feeling that she wants to be with them, she doesn't wanna be with him. And, it's so his case is really interesting in a lot of different ways. First of all, he came from a wealthy family, and he went to a, private
Mhm.
school, high school, and one of the signs I think of mental illness that was missed was, for graduation when they were taking pictures, instead of coming in a suit and dressed nicely like his others, classmates, he dressed in a crumply, uh, polo shirt and, with scraggly hair and, didn't really try to look good or even just neat at all. And that should have been a sign. He also wrote something weird in his, for I guess his yearbook to thank you for all the people who helped me or tried to help me. I don't know if I'm gonna graduate. I mean, these things, his family obviously missed all these signs. And, because that was the beginning. Schizophrenia usually starts in the late teens or early 20s or to mid-20s. And so I think he was gradually becoming more and more psychotic, and ultimately that's when he shot her. Um, when he was psychotic and he followed through. And it's so interesting also now his obsession with her was came about but when they met in school, summer school, when they were taking a course on uh deviant sexuality or various kinds of sexuality, something like that. What an interesting course to meet in and then become obsessed with her. And they did go out for had some meals together outside of school, and he interpreted that as meaning much more than what it really was. She obviously just wanted to be his friend, and he, developed this big crush on her. And then 2 years later, he it was so profound that, it took even after 2 years, he still found her and shot her, like, it was still destroying him, basically, bothering him, obsessing him so much that he tracked her down and shot her. And, it's just really sad, one of the things that I feel strongly about is that a lot of these kids who are school shooters, they should be able to be detected by teachers when they're in elementary school. A lot of them, first of all, are either loners or bullied. And so when you see a kid sitting at lunch again and again, alone, that is a little clue. And yet, oftentimes teachers um, won't necessarily refer that person either to the school psychologist or to an outside mental health professional. These kinds of things can be caught really early on because it's not like because the reason why they're often bullied or are loners come from the original part of the problem, which is the dysfunctional home. And bullies have radar to be able to tell which kids are the most are the weakest in a way, or the most emotionally unstable, so that they'll get the biggest reaction from them if they bully them.
And let's talk about so the loner piece and we've talked about different school shooters in different cases, and I want to bring in the Columbine high school shooter because in his journal, he also wrote, and again, I think of it as envy, and I think that ties into the loner aspect of it because here was what was in his journal. I see jocks having fun, friends, women. I hate the happiness that the jocks have. And then in contrast, he wrote about himself as being so different, not capable of functioning like a human being, and being a loner. It's like these loners, yes, that's a red flag, but they're also envious of what everybody else has. And so they think for whatever reason, Dr. Carroll, that they should go shoot everybody up, which is how do they make that jump and go to that next step of, let me be a school shooter?
Well, it's like if I can't have this life, this perfect life, then I won't let them have it either. I don't want them to have it.
And
Um, I mean, it's just anger at not having what other people have, and thinking of it as much bigger and better than it necessarily is. Um, you know, yes, there is a lot of envy. It's like, I'll show them, you know? Um, they think that they're so smart and they're so lucky and they're so, they've got all these friends and all of that. So it's wanting to destroy them because of being so envious of them.
let me say at Virginia Tech, the school shooter said this. He criticized the students and said, your Mercedes wasn't enough, you brats. Your golden necklaces weren't enough, you snobs. Despite this hostility, he also said this. Oh, the happiness I could have had mingling among you, being counted as one of you. So to me, that just, I mean, in the own words of these school shooters, why envy seems to be the motive, in addition to the mental health issues and the way they may have been raised, but it really gives them motive to do what they think is right.
Yes, yes, because they compare themselves, of course, to the other kids in their class and their school, and it's all not fair. And especially if they have some kind of paranoid mental illness, that fits right in, because they exaggerate it in their mind.
So let's go back to the red flags because you already mentioned the fact teachers, if there's a loner, that should be a signal or a red flag. And you and I think, can both say all day long that things happen in retrospect, that often there are reasons that people should be concerned about a child or report about a child. And they don't. Now, there are lots of reasons for that. I don't need to get into all those reasons right now, but what are other things that you, as a psychiatrist, see in children that to you says, wait a minute, this is problematic. This isn't the average kid. These are things that may manifest themselves in dangerous ways as the person gets older.
Well, I mean, we could look at Ethan Crumbly, for example. He is a classic case. Um, Now, we know that ever since he was a little boy, his parents were really not around. They neglected him. They left him at home without a phone, and he had to go to neighbors to get them to call his parents, who were often at a bar, and to get them.
Problem. There's a problem, but
Yeah,
I digress. Go ahead.
yes, and and he drew pictures. That's another way to see, if you look at your child's artwork, or a teacher looking at a student's artwork, and yes, that was ultimately a part of how he was caught, but kind of after too late, or they didn't do anything even after they saw this artwork, the guns and help me and all of that were cries for help. And so and of course, like, because they're typically abused, or neglected. Well, neglect is a form of abuse. Um, if you know their background, and I mean, I think that people, even if it's like parents of other kids, or even the kids themselves, I think that it is okay and even um useful to tell the teacher that you're worried about them. It's not that you're trying to get them in trouble, but you're worried about them, and that you think somebody needs help. I think that people should be more aware and try to help more, or even talking to the parents of the child first. Of course, if they're, I don't know that that would have helped in Ethan Crumbley's case.
I was just going to go there. And let me just say that about while we're talking about that and the parents, the parents charged with the crime in that particular case. Ethan Crumbley is a great example, I think. I'm the first to say there is nothing wrong with sitting in a bar. You may find me there some days, but I am saying if you've got young kids that you're responsible for, that's when it becomes problematic. You can't go sit in the bar and neglect your kids and let things happen to them. So, in terms of the parents, how do you feel about, or how would you react to the parents' responsibility? Ethan Crumbley's an example of, for those viewers and listeners who aren't aware, he was given the gun by his father as a present and shooting it, and it was seen on social media. And so the parents knew he was out there shooting the gun, didn't see a problem with it. But they did that in conjunction with what I would argue were cries for help by Ethan Crumbley. They ignored all those cries for help and supplied him with a gun, which was a perfect storm of perfect disaster.
Yes. I mean, he was unusual also in another way, that he asked for help. Most school
Mhm.
shooters, or before they become school shooters, they don't necessarily ask their parents for help or ask anyone for help. I mean, directly. He was making all these drawings and he was writing a journal and all of that. But so when he asked his parents for help, they basically said, like, buck up,
Fuck
I'm
up,
not quoting
Buttercup.
it directly, but they didn't take it seriously. They didn't get him help, even when the
Mhm.
parents were called to school that day, that morning, and they were told to get him help. They just went about their day and didn't even get him help right then, which of course, then just a little while later he shot up his school. Um, I'm so glad that is the case. It's not only classic in terms of the shooter, but it's also classic, or hopefully it will be a a classic as far as what happens to parents after
Yes.
their school shooters become school shooters. Um, because, perhaps if more parents saw that they are responsible, ultimately is the parent who's responsible. Because if you bring your child up in a way that where they feel neglected, or they certainly, if you abuse them, but if you don't bring them up in a healthy way, or however you bring them up, this is what determines what they become, whether it's a school shooter or an astronaut. you know it can go in all kinds of directions, and you have to take responsibility for that. Every little thing that you do really affects your child tremendously.
But then when you add to that the next step of providing your child with a gun unsupervised when they have all these requests for help, Barrow County, Georgia is where the other shooting happened. It actually was not in Barrow County. I think it was in Jackson County, but the one that happened recently, and in that case, the father also has been charged with the crime and is currently in jail, not just the son. And so when we look at that again, it's another example of when they provide the gun, when they don't provide assistance for cries for help. That again is when there's a nexus for our criminal justice system to now say, we're going to charge the adults, the parents in these cases. So I do think it's moving in a direction of making parents responsible for criminal activity of a child where they should have, could have known and prevented it, and shouldn't have provided them a gun to go off and do what they wanted to do. Now, in there's another case I just want to mention because I think before I started doing the research and a deep dive, I thought that a lot of school shooters would be doing it for revenge and seeking revenge. But the reality is the cases I've mentioned, and I have another one, it really doesn't seem to be for revenge, but instead because they're envious of the other kids that they're nothing like in their mind. So in 1998 in Oregon, this was Kip Kinkle. And he again went on a shooting spree at the school, an old story. And he had circled the face of the football captain in the football team's photograph. And he was actually on the team. Kip was on the team. The difference was the person that he circled the picture of was the best player, and he was going out with the girl that Kip liked. Kip was on the team, but he was on the bench. He was a loner. All these things you've mentioned, Dr. Carole, it's almost like you have an expertise in this because the things that you've mentioned, yet again, hold true with this particular school shooter.
Yeah.
And he's envious of what he doesn't have. It wasn't for revenge, he was envious.
Well, yes, actually, yes, I am somewhat of an expert at this. In fact, one of the school shooters that you, I think, are planning to mention, Michael Carneal, the in 1997 in West Paducah, Kentucky, I was at he, came and he came that morning with a gun and he shot at, the school prayer group. There were students who have a
Yeah.
prayer group in the morning. And he shot at them, and 3 girls died, and there were 5, others who were injured, and, I was actually the expert witness in the civil case from that incident. Yes, because now here this the reason why I was involved was because, I was involved in the civil case because the parents, wanted to sue, or they did sue both, video game companies and also, the movies, producers, particularly well, of 2 movies. One was, Natural Born Killers, and the other one was, um The Basketball Diaries. That was a 1995 movie. That was the main one, that he was copying Leo DiCaprio, the character in that movie who comes to school. He has a dream sequence, and he
Mm.
comes to school with a gun, and he shoots people. And Michael Carneal was asked, right after the shooting, and he was talking to the police, and they said, like, "Did you ever see anything like this before? What made you do this?" And he referred to The Basketball Diaries. So, the case was prepared. I was all prepared to testify, and the court threw it out. And that is because, they couldn't see the connection between, Michael Carneal doing exactly what Leo DiCaprio did and his doing it. There's a lag. People it's I've been, I was the head of the National Coalition on TV Violence back in the day and testified, to the Senate, about several times about media violence. And, and yet it is so hard to get people to make that connection. People don't wanna make that connection. They certainly understand it, but, they don't wanna believe that this could have such an impact. And, when Columbine happened, there was in Newsweek or Time, they did a poll to ask people what they thought caused the Columbine shooting. And there was a high percentage of people who did attribute it to media violence, and I thought, "Oh, great, my work is done." And
They've listened. They finally listened.
yes, and then, easily forgotten. Especially violent video games. They really don't wanna believe that there's a connection with that because so many people are addicted to violent video games.
And your brain isn't formed when you start playing all these games, and so it really can affect the brain development in individuals. But where do you draw the line? And here's what I mean by that. Where do you draw the line between the movie violence, the video game violence, versus responsibility for parents to monitor that, to limit the exposure?
Of course, yes. See, the sad thing is that the more dysfunctional the family, the more time the children have with nothing,
Mm.
with not going to a picnic or fishing with their family, so they sit alone in their room and they play violent video games. So it's kind of connected. The less involved parents are with their kids, the more they're going to do these kinds of things. And also as far as envy, it's not only the kids in their classes, but well, it is. I mean, in addition to them seeing them in real life, it's also on social media. They see the profiles of these kids, or what the other kids are supposedly doing, and how great it is, and how much fun they seem to be having, and all that, and that contributes to the envy.
Yeah, and, never mind that some of those kids that look to be doing so well on social media then commit suicide, right? Like, it's such social media is a whole nother beast that plays into all of this because you're right. Kids look at it and think they're perfect, they're gorgeous. Well, lighting and makeup and planning go into how a person looks, and that envy is not correctly placed often. If there's probably a better way to say that, but those are my thoughts around that. All right, so going back to the envy and school shooters and the red flags, in this particular case, Stephen Morgan, and it was interesting to me because I think doing my research, I would have expected him after he killed her in the bookstore. He gets on a little pulley system escape route to get down to the basement. He ditches the wig, he ditches the gun, and off he goes and he starts walking around. Do you have any insight as to why, and I'm glad he didn't, but why he didn't then go shoot at other people? Because school shooters often don't just kill one person, they just start shooting everyone.
Yes, mostly they do that because they're so filled with rage. Um, but, in this case, he was really fixated particularly on her. That's why he didn't, he didn't really care about, he just wanted to get back at her because she didn't love him the way he loved her. And he thought that that was because she wanted to be with the more beautiful people, and smarter people at her school in Wesleyan. It's so he had gone to college in Colorado, but he was a non-matriculated student. I mean, not trying to get a degree. And and it was during those 2 semesters, in between the 2 semesters of his being in college, that he met her during the summer at that summer school course. Um, so, he had opportunities. I mean, as I said, his parents were wealthy. He went to this private school. He did have opportunities, but I guess, and we don't know what kind of dysfunction there was in the house. I know there were lots of children, and perhaps he was just kind of neglected.
Right.
But I mean, he was certainly neglected. They certainly neglected the signs of his being mentally ill. But so I think that that's why, that's why he had the beginnings. He had some of the beginnings that he could have actually he could have been in college just like she was. And he went into the military for 4 years. It's amazing that he was able to do that. He didn't have any bad marks in the military. That part was kind of surprising.
You're right, because with the mental health issues, often you either see number one, they're not accepted into the military because it's identified what particular issues there are that need to be treated. Or number two, once they get there, there may be some type of behavior violation of a rule or of a law that makes them say, oh, they've got some mental health issues they need to address. But that didn't happen in this case. So, in this case, the other thing I did want to ask you about was you have all that about him, but then she actually filed a complaint. She took the step that we want people to take, right? When there are all these emails and phone calls, she did go and make a complaint. The investigation stalled out. They claim that she didn't pursue the charges. Well, they could still pursue the charges. So, what do you say to people who, number one, feel uncomfortable because of the actions of a person, but number two, after they make a report, nothing happens, and then she ends up murdered by him?
Yes, yes. That unfortunately happens a lot.
Mm.
Um, that not necessarily where it always ends in murder, but where something bad happens because the school didn't take action to try to stop the person. Um, yes, I mean,
Terrible.
it's true. She didn't go forward with the complaint, but they could have gone forward. I mean, it's just like with domestic violence. If the victim doesn't want to pursue the case, the state can still do that.
Right.
Um, so that was just very unfortunate. I mean, I guess maybe they thought, oh well, he's a college student. He's not going to do anything bad, right?
And I think there are a lot of assumptions around that, right? Your position in society, who you are, your resources, what you're doing with your life. There are a lot of assumptions and biases that really can be harmful at the end of the day. All right, Dr. Lieberman, let me get your last thoughts again on a case like this when now I'm surprised, but doing my research to learn that school shooters often are driven by envy. I think in this case, it was very clear that he was.
Yes. Um, well, I think that that is a very important um, quality or psychological way of thinking or feeling that people need to be aware of and to be on the lookout for. I mean, again, I just want to say that with this profile, there are so many places where the school shooter can be
Mm,
stopped in their tracks before they actually have the gun in their hand and are facing their schoolmates. Again, starting with a dysfunctional family, abuse or neglect, mental illness. That's one of the really the places where people so many people just let that fly. Like, first of all, they don't recognize their child needs mental health help, or they bring them to a psychiatrist once, or they bring them to emergency room once, and then they don't make that's what happened in Florida. Nicholas Cruz is a good example of how someone did get some attention, but the parents or the mother didn't follow through to make sure he kept going to sessions. I mean, she would call the police whenever he would
right.
do something like shoot animals or, be cruelty to animals, which is one of the three parts of the triad of a psychopath. Cruelty to animals, fire setting, and bedwetting. And so she
Mm,
called the police, and they would come, but sometimes they just wouldn't do anything, or if they did take him somewhere, she never followed through with it. So that's another thing where certainly something can happen. The violent video games, obviously, that's easy. You need to just say no. Um, then loner or being bullied. That's where teachers come in, where they can really identify the kids who are troubled. Not You don't know if they're going to necessarily end up as a school shooter, but you can tell that they're troubled and they need some help.
yeah.
Um, and then of course access to a weapon. Yes.
That one's so preventable. So to your point, all of this is preventable when you look back at all the different pieces, but stop supplying a weapon to someone with issues, mental health needs. It's not responsible. That doesn't need a weapon. All these kids, what do they need a weapon for? They don't need a weapon. It's not like they had to go out and kill animals in order to eat for the day, right? I digress again, but that's a big piece of that.
Yes.
Dr. Carole Lieberman, I adore having you on. Thank you so much for your great expertise and really helping spread the message of what to look for, how to handle it, and the fact that these school shootings can be prevented.
Absolutely. Well, my pleasure to be here. Thank you.